much. First of all, for the organizers, for this taking care of this very wonderful conference and tribute to your us and for allowing me to take part in it. Second, to Lutz, I think we know each other for more than 10 years now. For all of your help and assistance during this series, particularly in the work of my dissertation, but also postdoc project, but also more generally in formulating ideas and thinking about new ways to tackle difficult problems about ancient Jewish-Christian relations, textual relations. And without further ado, being acutely aware that I'm the only one standing between you and the end of this day, let us begin. But before we begin, I know that you have a handout. You can only access a handout through this QR code. If you're interested, it will remain here for several minutes, so no rush. Now let us start. I would like in the following minutes to say a few words about the complicated relationships between literary and socio-historical processes as are reflected in the rabbinic literature, particularly that produced during late antiquity in Byzantine Palestine, a period that knew quite a few dramatic historical shifts, not the least the, let us say, Christianization of the empire and Palestine in particular, shifts which by and large are not reflected, or at least not apparent, in rabbinic literature, which tends to be quite introverted and dealing mostly with issues of biblical exegesis and the minutiae of legal discussions. And nevertheless, this literature too is responding to and shaped by its larger context. But this requires attentive reading. I would like to demonstrate this type of, how to say, contextualization through a series of case studies from the Pesiqta of 10 Commandments, which happen to be the subject of my dissertation, as you just heard. This is a commentary, so-called, on the 10 Commandments, of course, which probably took its shape no later than the 6th century CE, though as usual containing much earlier material. If you look for the Pesiqta of 10 Commandments on your bookshelf, you will not find it. It is only preserved as part of a larger and a much later composition known as the Pesiqta Rabbati. Though both Pesiqtas are distinct in terms of language, terminology, content, and from now on, when I say Pesiqta, I refer to the Pesiqta of 10 Commandments to avoid confusion. A large portion of the Pesiqta have parallels in other parts of rabbinic literature. Put simply, it offers, for most part, more of the same, which can be a bit frustrating, but also offers ample evidence for the phenomena of the evolution of tradition, to which we will see several examples in a minute. At the same time, the Pesiqta also contains quite a few unique traditions, unique in the sense that they have no parallel elsewhere, but also in the sense that at least some of them present peculiar contents. Particularly important for the current discussion are several passages which concern the relationship between the Torah and the nations. Thus, and I will briefly introduce a few of them. In commenting on the third commandment, the Sabbath commandment, the Pesiqta reads as follows: remember the Sabbath day. Here, in Exodus, you say remember, but there you say keep. So the Pesiqta refers here to one of several variances between the two versions of the Decalogue in Exodus and Deuteronomy, offers several explanations. Among them, remember, the Pesiqta, he gave to the nations of the world, but keep, he gave to Israel. So on the one hand, there is a clear distinction between the nations and Israel, but at the same time, there is also clear acknowledging that the Torah was given also to the nations, in some respect. Another example from the fourth commandment on honoring the parents. There's in the Pesiqta in Leviticus 19 concerning the fear of parents. He placed the mother before the father. But here in Exodus concerning the honor of the parents, he placed the father first. Again, a reference to the distinction between two parallel legislation concerning the fear of mother and father, and the honor of father and mother. What is the reason for the change in the paternal order? The Pesiqta explained that here in Sinai, where the nations of the world here, he placed the father before the mother to exclude the Gentile who does not have a father. Now, notwithstanding the obscurity and possible pejorative undertones, or more than undertones of the last statement, it is clearly assumed here that the nations heard the giving of the Torah, and that it was formulated by with taking them into consideration. Thus, these and a few other statements in the Pesiqta present a strange, how would I say, tension between the idea that the Torah was given exclusively to Israel, which the Pesiqta seems to assume, and the admittance that the Torah is also somehow the Torah for the nation. And this tension between, let us say, the exclusive and inclusive facets of the Torah remains, I must say, unresolved throughout the Pesiqta. And it will also remain so in this lecture. This tension also affects the conceptualization of the nations themselves. Who are they in the mind of the Pesiqta as compared to other rabbinic compositions? And this would be that I would like to examine this last point through a series of case studies. Let us begin with counting for the Sabbath, that is, counting the weekdays in relation to the Sabbath. In one of the early rabbinic commentaries on the book of Exodus, the Pesiqta Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, which also Jan has referred to quite extensively, we read the following. When you count weekdays, you should count the first of Sabbath, the second of Sabbath, and so on until the eve of Sabbath. This insistence on counting or naming the weekdays by the Sabbath seems both pedantic and seemingly quite trivial. Why not? It gains deeper meaning when considered in the context of wider practices and convention of naming the weekdays after the planets or the deities related to them, like Sun Day, Moon Day, Saturn Day, and so on and so forth, which were quite common in the Greco-Roman world in different milieux. In another commentary on Exodus, roughly contemporaneous and possibly somewhat earlier, the Pesiqta Rabbi Ishmael, we find a similar statement with a different emphasis. You shall not count weekdays as others count, rather you should count them for the Sabbath. Here, on the one hand, there is clear rejection of the practices of others, but the nature of these practices is not entirely clear. It can refers again to naming to the naming of the weekdays, as we saw in the first statement, but it can also pertain more basically to the very notion of a 7-day weekly cycle, as opposed to other non-heptadic weeks, which again were practiced in different circles in the Greco-Roman area. In short, both statements in the Mechiltot concerning the referencing of the weeks to the Sabbath are clearly explainable or seem to reflect and react to practices and conventions in the Greek-Roman pagan milieu. What's happening in the Pesiqta? Here we find a more developed form of this kind of statement. It begins with a quotation from Jeremiah, which I quote here very literally. In one thing they are stupid and foolish, their vain instruction is wood, and goes on as follows. The nations of the world count the weekdays as the first of Sabbath, the second of Sabbath, and so on until the eve of Sabbath, and do not count the Sabbath. But Israel count the Sabbath as they were commanded. So on the one hand, we can find here formulations reminiscent of the two earlier phrases. The pedantic counting of the weekdays, according to the Sabbath, is reminiscent or almost identical to the Pesiqta Rabbi Shimon, while the insistence that the nations do not count to the Sabbath or for the Sabbath, that Israel do, is reminiscent of the Pesiqta Rabbi Ishmael, which is that you should not count like others, but you should count for the Sabbath. So far, so good. The Pesiqta seems to converge the formulations from earlier sources. But the Pesiqta also adds something new. It says that the nations of the world are those who count for the Sabbath. This not only diverges from the earlier sources, it also seems to offer a self-contradiction because, as we see, the nations do not count the Sabbath. So what's happening here? How do I say, an easy formulation of the Pesiqta would result from the reworking and merging of earlier sources. But I think that this reworking itself can also tell us something about the actual circumstances of the Pesiqta. On the one hand, the claim that the nations count for the Sabbath actually reflects actual practices in several early Christian communities, particularly Aramaic speaking, where the weekdays are indeed called Chag Shabbat, Ren Shabbat, and even Arubta, that is the evil Sabbath. And these are exactly the terms which are found in the Pesiqta, the Aramaic terms. On the other hand, the claim that the nations do not count the Sabbath, when read in relation to the biblical verse, that in one they are stupid and foolish, be'achat yivaru ve'yichsalu, this seems to reflect the Christian substitution of Sunday for the Sabbath. Thus, the Pesiqta, as it stands, with all its inherent tension, seems to reflect not simply, or to reject, not simply any non-Jewish counting of the weekdays, but particularly Christian practices which accept the Sabbath, but not as Jews, or exactly. I will now, let's move to another example, this time concerning a debate about the very nature of the Sabbath. The earliest form of this debate is found in the Pesiqta Rabbati, again, commentary on the book of Genesis, which was given its current form perhaps in the 5th century CE, but again, containing earlier material. Here we find a debate, one of several, between Tineius Rufus, a Roman governor also known from historical sources, and Rabbi Akiva, who doesn't need to be introduced, I think. In this case, Tineius asked Rabbi Akiva, how is this day, the Sabbath, different from all other days? And after a certain exchange, Rabbi Akiva answers that the Holy One, blessed be He, wished to honor it. To which Tineius immediately replies, whence can you prove this to me? So Rabbi Akiva offers several proofs. First of all, the River Sabbatianus proves it. It does not flow on Sabbath. And second, the necromancer proves it. They cannot bring the dead up in the Sabbath. And if you don't believe, go and check this. And Tineius goes and checks with his father, and it indeed works. And the story continues, but I will not go into it at the moment. That's a matter for another seminar. So the story presents a Roman pagan authority, which is addressed by, or whose question is answered by empirical proofs based on natural phenomena. Thus, while the story as it stands may very likely be a literary fiction, that it does offer what can be considered a realistic representation of the kind of answers which rabbis would expect from their pagan neighbors and the kind of answers that they would expect these neighbors to accept. Again, or not again, the Pesiqta offers the same narrative in a developed form and a somewhat more convoluted. After Tineius asks about the Sabbath and how can one prove that this day is the Sabbath, Rabbi Akiva in this version answers him that those who eat the manna bear witness to it, it didn't descend on the Sabbath, and also the necromancer bear witness to it. Then, as in the earlier version, Tineius goes, tries to ascend his father, or tries to raise his father, does not ascend on the Sabbath, but afterwards, a rather comical exchange between Tineius and his dead father issues, and eventually Tineius' father explains to his son that, furthermore, the river Sabbatianus bears witness to the Sabbath, it doesn't follow Sabbath, and recital that indeed it is written, on this day he rested from all of his work. You can argue with that. So this version offers a mixture of the same empirical proofs that we saw earlier with biblical arguments from the manna and from the creation account. Biblical proofs which quite strangely, are addressed to and put in the mouth of pagan Roman authorities. That is, taken at face value, this story assumes acceptance of the Torah by at least some Romans, which seems quite unlikely for figures like Timaeus and his father. So this could reflect simply, or well, it does certainly reflect literary reworking, which perhaps, how would I say, simply an accumulation of additional arguments for the Sabbath, which no longer takes into consideration the historical setting of this story, even though this is an imaginary historical setting. But perhaps this reworking also tells something about the shifting circumstances in which it was made. Or put differently, this story in the Pesiqta, as it stands, offers a shift from scientific to Torah-based arguments. And this literary shift in the content of the answers can perhaps tell us something about the nature of the others addressed here, which are no longer imagined as pagans, but perhaps Christian, or at the very least, as others who already are familiar with, and even to some extent adhere by, the Jewish scripture. Let us move to a third case study, Sabbath and circumcision. Again, we go back to Pesiqta Rabbati, to the same chapter. Right after the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Tiberius Rufus, we hear about another debate, this time between a certain philosopher who asked Rabbi Oshaya, or somewhat later Rabbinic sage, if circumcision is so precious, why was it not given to the first Adam? A rather harsh exchange develops, and at its end, Rabbi Oshaya does offer a concrete answer and says that whatever was created in the 6 days of creation requires further making. Mustard needs sweetening, wheat needs grinding, and even man needs to be finished off. So, what do we have here? The philosopher's question addresses a strange Jewish custom, which indeed was regularly mentioned and regularly ridiculed in Greek or Roman sources. The debate, both the question and the answer, before that, the question of the philosopher is formulated in biblical terms. He asks about the creation of Adam. But the actual argument, both of the philosopher and of Rabbi Oshaya, concerns, let us say, natural realities. The philosopher says, if circumcision is so good, why is not man or human being created circumcised? Rabbi Oshaya answers, any natural object needs to be finished by human preparation. So there is no problem here. Thus, again, the story itself probably is completely fictional, but it offers, realistic or at least reasonable Jewish pagan debate. The kind of debate which both, sides can expect to hear. That the rabbis imagine Romans expect to hear. The Pesiqta offers 2 other debates on the same subject, and I must say also in the same context, where this is all in the context of the Sabbath issue itself. According to the Pesiqta, first of all, Achilas the proselyte asked Rabbi Elazar, if circumcision is so precious to God, why was it not given among the 10 commandments? To which Rabbi Elazar says, it was given before the 10 commandments. As it is written, you shall keep my covenant. Clear, right? Perhaps not. Rabbi Elazar immediately explains, this is the covenant of the Sabbath and the covenant of circumcision. So far, so good. Now, a second debate, this time between a matron who asked Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Chalafta, the same question, why is not circumcision mentioned in the 10 Commandments? And Rabbi Yosef explained, it was already given in the 10 Commandments understood. As it is written, and the girl in your towns. Again, that's completely, perhaps not completely obvious, an explanation immediately follows. The girl, this is a proselyte who keeps the Sabbath and is circumcised by the covenant of Israel. Now, I can see by your faces that these answers might be somewhat forced. Indeed, they are. They very creatively find hints to the circumcision in verses from before or within the 10 Commandments, and still they diverge from, the plain meaning of the biblical text. In fact, what the Pesiqta is doing in both debates is reorienting earlier traditions, which are found in other earlier sources in different contexts and originally have very little to do with circumcision as such. So, apart from creative reworking, there is also in both questions another and perhaps more serious issue, and this is the focus on the Ten Commandments. The answers may be forced and artificial, but the question, why was not circumcision given in the Ten Commandments, is a question on its own right. And the meaning, or how would you say, the weight of this question will be more fully understood when we consider it in the context of broader debates and concerns about the status of the Ten Commandments in relation to the rest of the Mosaic Law. So let us have a brief look on a few sources. First, in the Palestinian Talmud, in Tractate Berachot, we hear in a very famous passage that it would have been appropriate to recite the Ten Commandments daily. Why are they not recited? Well, because of the grudge of the sectarians, or however you want to translate it, not a meaning, I'm really not sure. Anyway, so that the sectarians will not say they only were given to Moses at Sinai. So singling out the Ten Commandments can be problematic. And this, now, without entering the debate about who is sectarian or what the meaning are, in this case, we do find similar, or at least relevant, concepts in Christian and sorts of Christian sources. And thus, for instance, in another famous writing by Ptolemy the Valentinian, in a letter to a woman named Flora, who offered a rather sophisticated and complicated division of the, let's call it Torah. According to Ptolemy, it must be understood that the whole of that law, which is contained in the 5 books of Moses, is divided into the word of God himself, and Moses, and the elders of the people. But this is not all. The law of God himself, says Ptolemy, is again divided into 3 parts, of which the pure law, unmixed with inferior matter, is a Decalogue itself. And is only this part of the law which was not nullified one way or another by the coming of Christ. This part also needs to be completed or perfected, but we won't get into it. Thus, again, the Decalogue is a law of God which is retained. As for the rest of the law, it's a problem. Now, Ptolemy represents a type of Christianity which later, not so much later, would be considered heretic or Gnostic. But similar notions are also found, can be found in, how to say, more conventional writings. Thus, for instance, in the Didascalia Apostolorum, preserved in the Syriac version, possibly coming from Syria, perhaps from the early 1st century, which in one of its parts offers the following statement. The first law is that which God spoke before the people had made the calf and served idols, that is, the 10 sayings and judgments. And this law is fine. But after they have served idols, he rightly set upon them the bonds as they deserved. But you therefore, my fellow Christian, shall not set them upon yourself. Against these sources, the statement in the Pesiqta gains a much weightier importance. Both the question, why was not circumcision given in the 10 Commandments, and the answers that circumcision was indeed given before or in the 10 Commandments, thus shares the idea that there is a distinct status to this part of the law. An idea that, as we have seen, in certain heretical or Christian sources, was used in order to denigrate or even devalue all the rest of the Torah legislation. The Pesiqta, of course, did not accept this anti-linguistic argument, but nevertheless, by its insistence that circumcision is given somehow before or within the 10 Commandments, it actually offers an implicit acknowledgement of the idea of this idea that the Decalogue has a distinct and different studies. And the somewhat ambivalent standing of this phrase is further reflected in its literary setup. Whereas in Pesiqta Rabbati, we found a debate which is rather aggressive and addressed to a complete foreigner or outsider, just a pagan philosopher. The Pesiqta offers a rather factual and unmoved conversation with in-betweens. Akilas, a proselyte, and a Roman matron, or perhaps a woman called Matrona, two figures which feature also in other rabbinic stories and are always addressed in a rather honest or fair manner and are considered almost ones of us. They're on the border. Thus, the Pesiqta represents not so much the rejection of a certain argument which is presented by an outsider, but actually the acceptance or semi-acceptance of an idea, of an argument, which is presented by someone who is almost contained within the rabbinic community. I would like now to move to some conclusions. Yeah, and I forgot about this. I would like now to move to some conclusions and consider some broader implications of the particular case studies that I present. The sources that I presented to you offer different aspects and different dynamics of the converting of midrash, that is a literary form, within and in relation to a shifting world. I tried, or I hope I managed to demonstrate, the historical value of secondary revisions, not exactly because they change and diverge from original statements. They help us to see shifts and changes in the background of the rabbinic texts, which are not immediately apparent in the texts themselves. On the literary level, we can see here a very common phenomenon in rabbinic literature, the tension between preservation of earlier sources and the introduction of innovation in language and in content. It almost seems that in order to say something new, you have to use something old. So, these innovations, as we've seen, can and actually in many cases should be explained on the basis of or in consideration of internal developments, such as the convergence of earlier material or the convergence of earlier material or the reorientation of existing units into different contexts. But besides these purely literal consideration, we should not also forget, or they should also be examined, and they can also be used as reflecting the external conditions to which shaped or made possible their revision. As I tried to show, this type of careful reading and comparison of parallels within rabbinic literature can help us in the case of the Pesiqta of Ten Commandments to learn something about the tensions around Israel, the nations, and the Torah of Israel, or perhaps of the nations, in relation to each other. Reading the Pesiqta against the background of earlier rabbinic sources allow us to see, or at least allow me to argue, that we can discern how definite boundaries between Israel and those outside them are being readjusted. We saw how in the Pesiqta it is the nations, not only Israel, who count for the Sabbath. We saw how remember was given to the nations of the world, and that in Sinai, also the nations of the world heard the Torah. According to these and a few other similar statements, the Torah, or having a share of the Torah, is no longer the boundary line between Israel and its nations, or Israel and the nations surrounding it. This recognition, or this reconceptualization of the nations and the Torah in the Pesiqta creates new tensions and invites or demands, requires the formulation of new responses. But it also allows, or perhaps obliges, the Pesiqta to become not only responding to those surrounding it, but also to take part in new conversations with those nations who now share the Torah and share a large body of traditions, of debates and sensitivities, which are deeply familiar also within the Rabbinic world. Thank you very much.